I'm going to be talking about capital financing in general and tax-exempt bond financing in particular, and a little bit about other forms of financing at the very, very end. Tax-exempt bonds have been around forever. I bet every tax-exempt hospital in the United States has at least one bond issue outstanding. So why is this going to be a hot topic in the coming year? Well, I think there's a number of reasons. It became very popular for hospitals to issue variable rate tax-exempt bonds, which allowed the rates in the bonds to be reset every week. So you could borrow for a 30-year bond at short-term 7-day rates. It was just a fantastic technique. But you needed a letter of credit from the bank to back that bond issue. So if the bondholders tendered their bonds in 7 days, they knew there was a source to draw down on, the letter of credit at the bank, to pay for those what are called remarketed bonds. Most of those bonds had 1 or 3 year, most of those letters of credit expired in 1 to 3 years. And if you haven't found out already, if you have those kinds of bonds outstanding and you go back in the next 3 years to your letter of credit bank and say, we want to renew our letter of credit, they either won't be interested or they'll charge you a very exorbitant rate. So that form of financing has pretty much disappeared. Those bonds are going to have to be replaced by new bonds that are structured differently. So that's going to be one big source of demand for tax-exempt bond financing. All the consolidation, the acquisitions, the mergers and affiliations you heard Mike and Ed talk about, as Mike indicated, very often the if-come is join our system, we can give you access to more attractive bond rates, you can build that patient tower you always wanted to build, or that new ambulatory surgery center, you join our system, you can borrow at much lower rates. So we think that's going to give a lot of the community hospitals in particular who join these systems access to bond revenues that they didn't have before. Starting in 2007, when the financial crisis hit, a lot of hospitals put their capital financing projects on hold, as did many entities in this country, because there simply wasn't a capital market for about a year or so. With accountable care organizations coming along, as Jim talked about, there's a lot of things you're going to have to do in terms of technology needs, physician practice acquisitions, enhancing your facilities so they pick your ACO instead of somebody else's. All that takes capital, and tax-exempt bonds are the typical way of financing that. Things to keep in mind if you are contemplating a tax-exempt bond issue this year or in the near future is it's probably going to be a fixed rate issue now. That variable rate mechanism is pretty much gone because the banks don't have an appetite to issue letters of credit. But that can be a good thing. Rates are at an all-time low. I do think there's a silver lining in going to fixed rates right now for the hospitals. Whether you do a new issue or not in 2013, if you have an outstanding issue, you've got to realize the risk of an IRS audit. The IRS announced a little over a year ago it was going to randomly audit 100 hospitals as to their tax-exempt bond issues. Well, what are they looking for? Well, there's a number of rules you have to comply with when you issue bonds. Now, I've had consultants when I was at Metro come in and say, and lawyers come in and say, I want to do an audit. I have to admit in the last 3 years when I heard that as general counsel, I kind of had an allergic reaction to that word and kind of covered my wallet to make sure it was still there. But this was an area, given my bond background, that I was very, very concerned about because the consequences could be horrendous. If the IRS comes in and says, we want to go back to that 1985 bond issue that's still outstanding, or the 1990 issue, or even the 2000 issue, and see all your records of how the bond proceeds are spent. Does your hospital have those records? Do they even know where the money was spent? Is it still sitting in a bank account unspent? So I got a bond counsel firm to give us the parameters of what we ought to be looking at, formed an internal task force from finance, from accounting, from facilities, and from a representative of our law department. And they've been systematically going all through the records of how those bond proceeds were spent, how the hospital is being used, what leases, what management contracts. And then when we find what we think are problems, we can get bond counsel back involved to say, all right, here's the problems we found. How do we fix them? Help us fix them.